For any newcomers that we have, before we start, please make sure you guys have Visual Studio Code and Node.js already installed. If you guys go ahead and check the chat, I sent a cheat sheet link and we are going to be referencing that a lot. And if you guys go ahead and go under the resources tab, you guys will see installation links for both Node.js and Visual Studio Code if you guys don't have those already. So go ahead and please make sure you guys have that because it will make our workshop much easier. Welcome everyone to Introduction to React. And if you guys don't know what React is, that's completely okay. We're going to go ahead and talk about what React is, why we should use it, and we are going to be creating a very simple project today. And let's go ahead and let's get started. So the agenda for today, we are going to be talking about quite a few things today. So first off, we're going to go ahead and introduce what is React. Some of you guys may have heard it and may have even used it, but we're going to go a little bit deeper and understand why exactly do we use React or why it's more beneficial compared to just regular front-end development using just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Once we're done with our introduction, we're going to go ahead and step over to our setup. We're going to go ahead and talk about how to create a React app and what the file structure is going to look like. After that, we're going to go ahead and talk about what components are and how exactly they play an important role inside of React. And building upon components, we're going to learn more about props and how we can use them to our advantage to make our coding much, much easier and cleaner. And then we're going to go ahead and talk about React hooks. This is going to be a little bit of a more advanced concept, but it's going to introduce us to how data is managed, how we can pass data from one component to the other and update that data in real time. And lastly, we're going to go ahead and just very briefly touch upon how we can deploy these projects or these apps that we make, right? So let's go ahead and let's get started with our introduction. So what exactly is React? Does anyone want to go ahead and raise your hand if you guys have heard about React or even used it before? All right, so I see a couple raised hands. All right, okay, that's cool. So React is a component-based front-end JavaScript library that's used for web development. So as many of you guys know, web development is just simply creating websites, right? So for example, Facebook.com, Amazon.com, right? These are just simply examples of websites that exist. And React is actually a library that was created by Facebook. So a lot of the React or a lot of the Facebook applications you see, for example, Instagram.com, Facebook.com, those are going to be built in React. And you'll understand why they use React and why it was created in the first place. Because with HTML and CSS, a lot of the coding became very repetitive and it became very messy to deal with, especially when you wanted to make changes to your code. So it became very hard for Facebook to manage, and they decided that they need a much better solution to this. And hence, React came into play. So let's talk about what makes React different as compared to just traditional web development with just using HTML and CSS. With React, we're able to build reusable components. So you can kind of think of this as functions in coding, right? So when we're coding, sometimes you might be asked to make a function, right? For example, let's say a function that adds two numbers, right? Now, why would you want to create this function? Well, creating a function allows you to essentially use that function multiple times, right? You define it in one place, and you're able to just call it multiple times. And maybe you could change some parameters, right? So you can make it unique to that situation. In the same manner, React is also very similar, is we're able to create a single component, and what we're able to do is we're able to use that component in multiple places. Additionally, we won't be talking about, or we won't be doing any examples with backend services today, but this is definitely something that you guys can look at on your own time. Many of you guys know that many websites have a backend, meaning that they use some sort of database or some sort of more advanced code logic to be able to store some data, right? For example, user data, right? For example, when you go to facebook.com, right, and you log in, you see a personalized feed, right? You see posts that you have made, posts of your friends, your personal friends and who they are, and everything is a very personalized experience, right? And the way they're able to achieve that is because they use a backend service, either through databases or through various forms and flavors of JavaScript. And one of the most common flavors is Express.js. So if you guys are definitely more interested on the backend side of web development, feel free to check out how backend can very easily integrate into the front end, because that is one of the major issues with web development is how can you connect your backend services? So how can you connect your databases, your server side code to your front end, right? How can you display that database information and take it and display it onto something a user can see, right? Does anyone have any questions so far before we move on? No? Okay, perfect. So let's go ahead and let's move on to a very confusing yet very similar concept. So how many of you guys have heard of React Native? Yep, few hands. Okay, okay. Now, it is very you guys do have to be careful not to mix them up. There is a difference between just React and React Native. Now, the difference is that just React is used for web development, right? So for example, Facebook.com, Instagram.com, those are websites, right? That we can see on our on our phones, on our laptops, on our desktops, and so on, right? Whereas React Native is used for app development, right? And the good thing about React Native is that you don't have to code in a language certain to iOS or certain to Android. You just code in JavaScript, right? So it's one language, but you're able to deploy on two platforms, but on both iOS and Android. And that's what really makes React Native powerful. And that is just something to watch out for, is just try your best not to get them confused, because the syntax can be very, very similar, but at the same time, it can be different. So we definitely want to make sure we don't run into any of those errors. And the reason they're kind of the same is they rely on the same structure. Both are component-based, meaning that they have some sort of components, right? Some sort of functions in their website, and they define it in one place, and they just simply call it multiple times, right? Okay. So with that being said, let's go ahead and let's talk about our setup. So what we're going to do is we'll talk about what this code is, and then we're going to go ahead and set it up inside of Visual Studio Code. So whenever we want to go ahead and create a React app, there are a few necessary things that we need to do in order to set up our app. So first off, we need to go ahead and create a React app. Now, unlike just basic front-end development, which uses HTML and CSS, the code is very simple, right? You have an index.html and a styles.css, and that's it. With React, it's a little bit more complicated, but do not fear, it's not too intimidating once you understand the structure. So we'll go ahead, we'll review the structure really quickly, and then we'll come back to these commands here, because we are going to be using these commands to go ahead and start up our React app. Okay, and then there are a few more commands, and we'll come back to these commands later on. But for the structure, once we go ahead and create our React app, you guys will see a structure that looks or has a lot of files. And that's okay. We aren't going to be dealing with many of these files anyways. We are only really going to be dealing with about 4 or 5 of these files. So luckily, we don't have to spend too much time worrying about, does this file have the necessary components? This is going to be done by JavaScript automatically, so we don't have to worry about anything like that. So with that being said, let's go ahead and let's actually start up our app. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and open up Visual Studio Code. You guys can also go ahead and follow along, as we are going to be doing our project together. Okay. Can you guys all see my screen?
Yep.
Yes? Okay, perfect. So you guys will notice on one side, I have Visual Studio Code, just a blank editor. I haven't done anything in here. And on the right-hand side, I have a browser just so I can see all my updates and see my website in real time. So what we're going to do is once you guys have a text editor open, preferably Visual Studio Code, we are going to go ahead and create our React app. So if you guys remember the command in the chat as well. Okay, cool. So this is the command that's going to be used for us to actually create our React app. So I'm just going to go ahead and create my app inside of documents. I'm going to say npx create React app, and then I'm going to go ahead and give it a name. And for example, here we can just go ahead and do workshop. Notice one thing. So the only thing that I changed was just the name of my project, right? So we have like 3 arguments here, right? We have npx, which is just using the Node package manager. We have create React app, which essentially creates a template. And the last thing, our app name, is simply just going to be whatever we want to name our app. So if we go ahead, press enter, go ahead and give it a second, and it's going to go ahead and install the necessary dependencies, the necessary files. So we'll go ahead, we'll give it a second or two to go ahead and do that. So I encourage you guys to go ahead and do the same as well, because sometimes this can take a few minutes. In the meantime, while that's doing its own thing, we'll go ahead and we'll come back to our different commands. Okay, so right now we have completed the first step. We have created a React app inside of a folder named whatever we named our app. Next, we're going to go ahead and cd into that app. For those who don't know what cd means, it simply means we are going to transition our terminal. We're going to change our directory into the second argument. So in this case, our app name. And then we are going to go ahead and just once we change our directory, we're going to go ahead and type in code dot, and that's going to open up a Visual Studio code editor with all the files in that folder. Once we have that, we can go ahead and run npm start. What this will do is this will go ahead and start up a development server. This way, we can go ahead and test out our code, right? Because when we're writing our code, it's very important that we test everything out, make sure our code is working, we don't have any errors, and just small things we might need to check. And this is going to be a very important step, especially in web development, is you want to make sure any websites you create are responsive, display the correct information, and you want to make sure they're appropriately sized, right? For example, you want to make sure your titles don't take up the entire screen, right? You want to have them appropriately sized, right? But when we are ready, once we have our completed app and we are ready to deploy it somewhere, what we can do then is we can go ahead and say npm run build. Now this will go ahead and build an optimized version, because with the development version that we had before, the development version is kind of very user-friendly, right? But at the cost of being user-friendly, it's also slow for the browser to be able to optimize and be able to run efficiently, right? So that's why with npm run build, we're able to build an optimized version. And it doesn't matter how that process runs. That is something that JavaScript does by itself. So that is not something that we have to worry about. We just have to make sure that inside of our development server, everything looks the way that we want it to. And we've already talked about the structure. So let's go ahead and let's check up on our React app. So it is done creating. So you'll see some of the commands that we were just talking about, right? If we scroll up a little bit, we can see like npm start, it starts the development server, npm run build, and the cd, so changing our directory into that project, and npm start to just start our deployment server. So let's go ahead, let's do that. So I'm going to cd into my project, and here if I go ahead and I'm just going to go ahead and list out the different things inside of my project. So notice we have quite a few things in here. And so let's go ahead, let's open that up using code dot. And this will go ahead and open up my React project. So here we can see the different files, right? We have node modules. Node modules is, if you guys go ahead, open it up, you guys will notice there's tons and tons of folders. This is something we don't need to worry about. So we can just leave it as is. This is something JavaScript does by itself. And then here we have the public folder. We won't be touching upon this too much today. This is mostly going to be used for development or when we deploy our app. Where we are most likely going to be concerned is this SRC or source folder. Here we see quite a few things. We have app.css, app.js, app.test.js, index.css, and so on and so on. So the main one that we're going to be concerned with is going to be app.js. And once you guys open it up, you guys will see there's actually some starter code here. And that's completely okay. The starter code is there just to go ahead and start you guys off. So what I'm going to do is I want to go ahead and see what I have so far, right? I want to go ahead and start my deployment server. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead, go over to terminal, click on new terminal. And this will just open up a terminal inside of my workshop app. From here, can someone tell me what command we use to start our development server? Any raised hands or in the chat? Anything?
npm start.
Yes, sir. All right, so we'll go ahead, we'll say npm start. Go ahead, give it a second or two to load it up. And once that's loaded up, we are going to go ahead and see our development server open up on localhost 3000. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just make sure these files are side by side so we can see everything in real time. Alrighty. Okay, right, so I have my app or my React app on the left side and I have my browser on the right side. It's okay if it takes a little bit time to load. This is the first time. So it's just compiling everything, making sure it runs. And this is what we should see. We should see a rotating React logo. And then it says like edit app.js under the source folder and save to reload, right? And then it gives us a link about React, right? So what we're going to do is clearly we're not making an app to do this, right? We want an app to do something else. So we are going to go ahead and just delete everything from the header tag to the closing header tag. So all we should be left with is simply a div tag that has class name of app and the closing div tag. And then we'll go ahead and we'll save it. So Command S or Control S. And notice immediately upon saving that my browser updated that automatically. So this is one of the benefits of React is that we're able to instantaneously see our changes when we save them, right? So now we do see quite a few things here in terms of syntax. So let's actually go ahead and talk about what all that syntax means before we start coding. So let's go ahead, let's go back to our presentation. And here, now we introduce the concept of components. So what is a component? So a component can either be two things. It can either be function-based or it can be class-based. However, the more modern version of React is moving towards function-based components. And the reason will be of the new addition of arrow functions in JavaScript. If you guys don't know what arrow functions mean or what their use cases are, that's completely fine. You can kind of just think of them as regular functions for now, right? So if we take a look at this image here, right, we have const, and then our function name, so navigation, for example, we set it equal to, and then here we have our parentheses for any parameters, right? Like how we have inputs for our functions. And then we have the arrow. And then inside of the curly braces, this is where we have our function code, right? And in React, so usually inside of a function, you might have, say, like add a plus b, right? Or like C, C is equal to a plus b and return C, right? In the same way, that's exactly what we're trying to do here. Instead, we don't need the intermediary steps, right? We can just say return this component. And what you guys will notice is the code that we saw in app.js and the code that we see here looks a lot like HTML, right? Notice these div tags. These look a lot like the type of coding or the type of syntax that we see in HTML, and that is correct. However, there are a few twists to this just because of the way that React works. Not everything transfers completely. So instead, it's a new syntax called JSX, which is essentially just a blend of JavaScript and HTML. This way we can display data that we get from JavaScript code into our HTML and be able to integrate both of those components very nicely. And once we go ahead and build our components, put our JSX code right inside of our return statements here, we need to go ahead and actually export them in order to use it, right? So for example, when you guys create a function, right, you have to create the function and then actually call the function, right? You can kind of think of this as calling the function in a way, right? We export it. This way we are able to call it inside of other components, right? And the power of components is that once we create one component, we can add it multiple times, right? So let's go ahead and let's take a look at a diagram that would kind of help us understand how components are used throughout an app, right? So for example, let's go ahead and take the example of a personal portfolio, right? So inside of a personal portfolio, what are some things you guys might have, right? Do any of you guys want to mention some things you guys might want to include inside of a personal portfolio?
Some contact information, maybe.
Yeah, that's a great example, right? Yeah, I see projects, obviously some contact information. We have, maybe some, a bio, right? Describing who you are, perhaps a picture, an about me section, right? These are all wonderful things to put inside of a personal portfolio, right? And this personal portfolio is definitely a project that you guys can start with React. It's going to look great on your resumes, and it's a nice way to display everything about you guys, right? So let's go ahead and let's take that example of personal portfolio, right? We are going to have our main app. You can kind of think of this as app.js. This is where all our code is going to be stored, or where our main function is going to be. Inside of there, we are going to have multiple components, right? For example, the navigation bar, right? Maybe at the top of your personal portfolio, you have links to say to your GitHub portfolio, to your LinkedIn portfolio, to say your resume section, to your project section, things like that, right? And then you have another component for your main body. And this main body would consist of subcomponents, right? So maybe you have your main body, and inside there, you have your about me. You have a picture of yourself. You have a bio. You have a resume. You have projects. You have contact information, right? Something like that, right? Obviously, you're not limited to how many subcomponents you can have, right? You could build upon this, right? Maybe inside of projects, you have, a project title, a project description, right? Technologies you used inside of that project, right? You can keep on breaking down each of these components, right? And obviously, for example, let's take projects, right? Obviously, you might have more than one project, right? So what you might be interested in doing is creating a simple like template component, right? That would have, some input for project name, project description, project technologies, and use that multiple times, right? So let's go ahead, let's try that out. So let's go back to our React app right here. And what I'm going to do is, first off, we are going to go ahead and create a components folder. The reason we do this is there's no like performance benefit, but it's more so of keeping our code clean and understanding having a concrete file structure. It just allows us to work collaboratively with others because others will also follow the same structure, right? And especially when you have the same structure, it's easy to work with others on the same project and be able to contribute to projects. So we'll go ahead, we'll call this components. And then inside of components, this is where we are going to go ahead and say, let's go ahead and let's create a component that just says header. And inside of my header folder, I'm going to go ahead and create a new file. I'm going to call this header.js. Perfect. Now, this should go ahead and open up a blank file under header.js. Yep. Okay, now what we need to do is now we need to go ahead and create that function, right? Our function-based component. Now, there's two ways we could do this. One, we could type it out, or two, we could use a VS Code extension that does it for us. Now, if you guys don't know about this extension, that's completely okay. What you guys can do is go over to your extensions tab, which is these like 4 squares here. And if you guys just search up React, it's going to be the first extension that pops up. It's going to be called ES7 Plus, React, Redux, React, and so on. And you guys can read the documentation about how to use it and whatnot. But essentially what it does is it allows us to be able to do really cool things, such as writing essentially like a keyword. And what that keyword will do is go ahead and convert it into a React function. So for example, my favorite one is RAFCE, or a React arrow function export component element. It's a really long name, that's okay. How did I come up with this? I didn't. I looked inside the documentation, found one I really liked, and I was like, you know what? This is it. This is my keyword. And once I have this, I press enter, and voila, we have all the starter code done for us. We have our function. And notice one thing about this function though. What do you guys notice about the function name? How did it know to say header? Why didn't it say like navigation or app or something else? Any ideas as to how that worked?
Is it because the file's name is header?
Yeah, it's because the file name is header. And the reason this is really important is, once again, this also helps other readers understand your code much better, right? And also helps you understand your own code, right? You want to be able to look at your projects like 2 months later and be like, yes, I know what I did, right? So whenever you guys are creating files, try your best to make the component name the same name, right? So now that we're here, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and you'll see that we have div tags already set up. So we want to go ahead and insert content inside. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just add my parentheses outside the div tag. This way I can go ahead and put everything on multiple lines. And another neat trick inside of VS Code is if you guys go ahead and press Option Shift F, it will go ahead and automatically format your code. I'm not too sure what the command is for Windows, but for Mac, I know it's Option Shift F. If any of you guys know the command, please feel free to share it in the chat. Once we're here, what we're going to do is I want to go ahead and just display my name, right? So I'm going to go ahead, go under the div tag, and I'm going to go ahead, put an H1 tag that says my name. Now let's go ahead, let's save this. And you guys are going to notice we get an error. Any ideas as to why we get this error? Kind of think back to when you guys create functions in like C++ or Python or Java, right? Or especially C++, that's one of the easiest ways to think about it. When you guys return something inside of a function, how many things do you guys return? You guys return one thing, right? It's the same thing here. But what are we doing here? We're returning two things. We're returning a div tag and an h1 tag, right? Obviously, this is a problem. So what we need to do is we need to put our h1 tag inside of a parent element. In this case, the parent element is going to be a div tag. Now, if I go ahead and save this, I should see my name pop up here. Oh, yeah, okay. My name didn't pop up here. Anyone want to give a guess as to why? We did all the correct code. We didn't run into any errors. We exported our function. We should see our code here. Why don't we see it? Any ideas? Yeah, that's correct. We never called the function, right? So where do you guys think would be the most appropriate place to call the function? Do you guys remember where the majority of our code is stored? Or kind of like where our main page is? Yeah, it's in app.js. So let's go ahead, let's navigate over to app.js. And here, once again, we can only return one thing at a time. So I will put this component inside of my div tag. And here, a really neat trick with React is if I go ahead and just say open angle bracket, and I go ahead say the name of my component. So for example, header, notice how it already gives me the selection, right? And if I go ahead, just press enter, notice it imports that component for me. And that saves me work. I don't have to worry about that anymore, right? And notice we still get an error here, right? And that's just simply because we need to close off this component tag, right? So we can go ahead, say / and close off that angle bracket, right? And notice this kind of looks like HTML syntax, right? Now, what's the difference between this and like your typical HTML syntax? It's just now we're using a component name, right? And a very small thing you guys might not have noticed is notice, I kind of did this like subconsciously, but notice I started with a capital letter for my file name, my component name, and when I called my component, right? The reason we do that is because sometimes your component names might interfere with regular HTML syntax. Because remember, HTML syntax is all in lowercase, right? For example, this div tag, it's div with the lowercase d, not a capital D. So this just helps us kind of differentiate between our components and HTML syntax. So let's go ahead, let's save this. And voila, we see our name, right? Perfect. So let's go ahead, let's make this a little bit more interesting. So let's go back to a header.js and let's go ahead, let's put in some other information. What's some other information we can put?
Social security.
All righty, social security it is.
Wait, hold on, wait, no. Don't do that, don't do that.
Oh, I was just gonna put a dummy number.
Oh, okay, yeah. For sure.
All right, so let's go ahead and this time we can use an h2 tag, or we are open to all the different types of tags in HTML, right? So if you guys don't know the different types of tags in HTML, that's okay. You guys can always refer to their documentation, see what the different tags are and how you can use them to output different things to your web page, right? For example, a p tag. Anyone know what a p tag does? Or what a p tag like symbolizes? Yeah, a paragraph, right? So it stands for like the paragraph tag, right? Wait, yeah, this should say. Okay, wait, I'm gonna try. Okay, yeah, there we go. Okay, so let's say like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There we go, right? So notice it shows up much smaller, right? And that's simply because we used a p tag versus an h1 tag, right? The reason we do this, and the reason we use an h1 tag for certain things, and the reason we use p tags, that's a whole workshop for a whole different time, right? Because there are certain optimization tricks, certain CEO like search engine or SEO, search engine optimization tricks that you guys can implement, and that's definitely something to work or to look into if you guys are planning to go into web development. But for now, I'm going to keep it very simple. I'm just going to go ahead, put a p tag, say like social security, right? And give it a number, right? So here, notice every time I save, the site goes ahead and updates. Perfect, right? Okay, so with that being said, now let's go ahead and we'll talk about props, right? So remember how we talked about inputs to our functions, right? How we can have parameters, right? Let's go ahead and let's look at how we can do that inside of React. So if we come back to our presentation, so props. Now, let's go ahead and let's think about this problem, right? We need to use the same component, right? But with different information. Do you guys think we should create a new component, or should we think about something else, right? And solution is no. We should find a better way to do this, right? We don't want to be copying and pasting code, right? And this is where React props comes into. If you guys are confused as to why it's named props, it's because it's called properties, right? It's just short for properties. So here, for example, we have our header component, right? And notice this time inside of the parentheses, we have props, right? And you can kind of think of this as a single data set that contains all of our properties, right? And we'll talk about how this looks and how we can pass in values into these properties. And notice that now, when I actually create my component, notice I don't hard code a name or a hard code an age or social security number, right? Instead, what I'm doing is I'm using the input from my properties, right? So I'm saying like properties.name, right? And this is, again, under the assumption that I passed in a property of type name, right? Or of name, if that makes sense, right? And the same goes for age, right? Now, there are two ways to do this. You can just say props and then go ahead and say props dot and then that variable name. Or you guys can also go ahead and destructure props inside of the parameter. So just add a little curly braces and say like name, comma, age. This way, now I don't have to say props dot, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and let's take a look at how exactly this works inside of React. So we're going to go ahead and use the same component. So I'm going to go ahead and just say props here. And instead of my name, I'm going to go ahead, delete that, and put some curly braces. And what the curly braces do is they essentially allow us, or they tell HTML that, hey, we're not using HTML code anymore. Now we're using JavaScript code. So now here I can say props.name, right? And here I'll go ahead, I'll give it a label so I know exactly what I'm looking for. And here we'll go ahead and we'll do the same thing. We'll say props.number. Let's go ahead, let's save this. Okay. Okay, now, once that is saved, what do you guys notice about our website? We don't see the name and the number that we just had, right? We don't see the name, like, for example, your personal name or like your social security number, right? Why do you guys think that is? Any ideas as to why that might be? Let's think back to functions, right? When you guys create parameters inside of functions, what else do you guys need to do when you call that function?
Gotta get the arguments.
Yeah, we need to pass in arguments, right? So that's exactly what we need to do too. And where do you guys think we can pass in arguments? Any ideas? And a quick hint, like, let's think about where we call this component. Yeah, so I see in the chat from Daniel, we have app.js, right? That's exactly what we're gonna do. So let's go ahead, let's go over to app.js. And here, this is where we called our component. So inside there, what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and say the name of our variable. Remember that was just name, right? And we're gonna set it equal to, and here we can pass in our value. Since I want to pass in a string value, I'm going to go ahead and enclose it inside quotations. So here, I'm just going to go ahead and say my name. But remember, we also had our social security number, right? So for that, what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say number is equal to, and once again, I can pass in a string. Perfect. Okay, and one thing that you guys should note is notice how my variable names here, so name and number, match these variable names here. And that's going to be very important because that's how React is able to find and be able to match up your properties. So let's go ahead, let's save this. And perfect. Now we see our name and we see our social security, right? So now what I want to do is let's go ahead and we are going to go ahead and add another header component. This way we can kind of see the advantage of props and components together. So now let's go ahead and this time we'll use a different name. So we'll say Highlander. And for our number, we are going to go ahead and say just go back in reverse. And then we are going to go ahead and close that off. Perfect. Okay. So now I have the same component, but this time I changed up the properties. So what do you guys think is going to happen this time? Do you guys think we will see two headers of the same using the same properties? Two headers using different properties, potentially a compilation error or something totally different? What do you guys think? Two headers? Okay. And what about the information inside of those headers? Are they going to be the same? Are they both going to say like Divyank and 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way through 9? Or are they both going to say Highlander? Or are they going to be different? Or both are going to be blank? Different properties? Okay. Anyone else have any ideas? Okay. So we're getting quite a few answers. Okay. So let's go ahead. Let's test this out. Okay. So I went ahead and saved it. And notice we got two headers. So that part everyone got correct. And notice that each one has unique values, right? For the first one, we had my name, so Divyank Shah, and the social security number of 1 through 9. And for the second one, we had a name of Highlander and a different social security number, right? So here, this is really the advantage of components and props together, is notice how we had inside of header.js, we kind of had a template, right? We didn't specify, we didn't hard code any variables or any values, right? We didn't hard code the name here. We didn't hard code the number, right? Instead, what we did was we created properties and we used those properties to be able to use our components again and again. So for example, if I copy it again and I change this to say Scotty, and if I make the, the number or something random and save this again, notice that we get a third unique component, right? So this is really the big advantage with props and components together, is that we're able to do this kind of thing where we're able to use the same template component, but be able to customize it to our user, to whatever data we have, right? So let's kind of think of this as to like why this is useful, right? Anybody want to tell me why this might be useful? And try to think of like real life examples, right? Any ideas as to how this might be useful in a real application? So you guys can kind of think of like, back to like Instagram or, Facebook, Twitter, things like that, right? Or any, big websites that you guys know.
Yeah, if you have like posts that have like the same thing, like same layout pretty much, but you want to like instantiate multiple versions of them, just change like their title or their picture, you could probably use this like for sure.
Yeah, that's one great example, right? Yeah, and then we have another answer in the chat, multiple elements with the same structure, right? Yeah, so kind of like how we have here, right? And especially that post example, that was a really good example, right? For example, if we take like a Facebook post or a Twitter post, right? We notice there are common things between each post, right? Each post has a name. Each post has users. Each post has likes and dislikes, right? Each post has a comment section, right? So these are things that we could implement inside of our template component. So inside of like header.js, and then inside of app.js, we would simply create multiple copies and just change their properties, right? Okay. So does anyone have any questions about components or props and how we can use them before we move on? No? Okay. So let's go ahead, let's go back to our presentation, and we are going to go ahead and start talking about React hooks. So how many of you guys have heard about React hooks? And we're not talking about like the fishing hooks at the end of a fishing line. No? Okay. So now, let's say we were developing our website and now we run into another issue, right? We're running into way too many issues for a website, but that's how web development is. Now, let's say we need to work with data or variables that update during runtime. Is this even possible? So that might sound a little confusing. Let's think about this in terms of C++, right? Language we're all familiar with, right? So for example, let's think of a linked list, right? A linked list, you don't exactly know how many elements are going to be inside of that list, right? Instead, what do? You kind of make elements on the fly, right? You use the new keyword, right? And you create them on the fly, right? You create them during runtime, right? You don't say like, you don't hard code like, this list will only have 5 elements, not more, not less, right? And so it's kind of like the same concept there, right? So this time we are working with variables inside JavaScript, right? And if we want to update them, right? So let's say, maybe every time we click a button, we increase the number, right? So for example, on a post, when you click the like button, the number of likes should go up by 1, right? So that's something that we can definitely try out, right? And what React hooks are is they're essentially a collection of special functions that allow for data manipulation at different stages. And there are, since I did say a collection, so there are, tons of functions. However, today, we're just going to be working with one of them. And this is most likely going to be the most common one that you guys use when you guys are creating your websites. And this is called the useState React hook. And what this does is this works with data while the information is being displayed, right? So the syntax for this is we are going to go ahead and start off with the const keyword to set up our function. And we are going to have square brackets. And inside of those square brackets, we are going to have 2 things. We are going to have a variable name. And the second thing is going to be a function that changes our variable, right? So for example, maybe when we click a button, we want to go ahead and update our variable, right? And to be able to update that variable, we go ahead and we use like a set variable name or, something along that to actually update it. We're going to go ahead and set that all equal to the useState function. And this is going to be a special React function. And inside of the parentheses there, we're going to go ahead and give it the initial value, right? Because when we're dealing with data, the first time our website loads, we always want some sort of initial data, right? Maybe like 0 likes, right? Or 0 dislikes, 0 comments, right? Or maybe if you're in a game, you might be like 3 lives left, right? And each time you lose a life, you decrease by 1, right? So this is, that's why it's like very important that we also set up an initial value, right? So let's go ahead, let's look at how exactly the syntax is going to look, and then let's go ahead, let's implement one. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a button component. And what we're going to do is we are going to press the button, and each time the button presses, we want to go ahead and update the value that we see, right? So notice in this code here, we first off, we have our basic React, our function component structure, but there are quite a few new things. So first off, we imported this use state, right? This allows us to be able to use the React hook, right? So kind of like how we import React, right? It's the same thing here, right? This is a statement that we do have to do ourselves because many times React might not do it for us. So this is something that we have to watch out for. And then inside of our function, our function component, we go ahead, we set up that React hook. So we say const my variable name, so count, and then the function that is used to update count. And finally, I set it equal to useState and my initial value of 0. Then what I do is I go ahead and I just create a function that kind of deals with updating my count variable, right? Right now, it doesn't seem like a very appropriate solution, but later on, you might realize that there are multiple things you might need to do, right? Maybe every time you click the like button, you might have to update it on your website as well as the database, right? So this is definitely, it's always a great solution to have just a separate function that deals with updating values, right? And then notice how none of this is in the return, right? This is kind of like code inside of our function body, right? And then we come on to our return, right? So as we've seen before, we have our div tag, and here we have a button. And here, notice that we have the on click, and we set it equal to, right? Kind of like the props, right? Remember how props also had a very similar structure. But this time, instead of quotation marks, we use curly braces. Do you guys remember what the curly braces mean?
We're coding in JavaScript now.
Yeah, we're coding in JavaScript now, right? We're telling HTML that, hey, this is JavaScript code now, right? So here we go ahead, we pass in the name of our function that deals with this update. And if it's going to go ahead, reference this increase count, and it's going to go ahead and set count to whatever the previous value was and add 1 to it, right? And here I just give some text to the button saying like, hey, click me, right? And then we have our closing tag for button, right? And also what I do is I go ahead and I actually display my count, right? This way we can kind of see what exactly JavaScript is doing in the background to make this work, right? So let's go ahead, let's try this out. So we're going to go back over to VS Code right here. And I'm going to go ahead, just delete these 2 components. We're going to just stick with 1 for now. And here I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder. We're going to create a new component called button. Inside of button, we are going to go ahead and say button.js. Here, again, we have 2 options, right? We could type everything out, or we could use the React extension. So I'm going to go ahead and use Rapsy, as I like to call it. That's going to go ahead, set up the code. Notice how it didn't import the use state, right? So let's go ahead, let's do that first. So we're going to say import use state from React. Perfect. And now let's go ahead, we'll enclose this in parentheses so we can go ahead, open it up on multiple lines, format everything, perfect. So first off, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and create a button. So let's go ahead, let's create a button that says click me. And then, yeah, okay, we'll go ahead, we'll start there. And then inside here, we are going to go ahead and update, or we're going to add our button component. Perfect. It went ahead and imported it for us as well, so we don't have to worry about that. We won't be passing in any prompts, so we can go ahead and save it. And perfect. We have our button here, right? It says click me. If we click, nothing really happens, right? So let's go ahead, let's add that functionality. So let's go back to button.js. And here, what we're going to do is let's set up our React hook. So we're going to say const. And remember, we need two things here. We need first our variable name, count, and then a function to update that variable. Now, the standard convention is you do set and then your variable name. This way, your naming is like very consistent throughout, and it's also easier for other users because this is kind of like the standard convention for React. We're going to go ahead and set it equal to use state. And what do you guys think we should set up as the initial value? For now, we'll, 0. Perfect. So we'll go ahead, we'll give it a value of 0, right? Now, what we'll do is I want to go ahead and output this data to the user. So here, I'll go ahead, I'll just create a simple p tag. And I want to go ahead and output it. So remember, to output data or output JavaScript code, we use the curly braces, right? And here we say count. Perfect. Let's go ahead, let's save this. And here we see that we have the value 0, right? And the way we can test this is if I change this 0 to like say 90, we should see that this updates to 90, and it does. So we know that this count is referring to this React state or React hook. So let's go ahead, let's set that back to 0. And let's go ahead, let's try clicking on the button. When we click on the button, do we see our variable being updated? No, we don't, right? Notice that no matter how many times we click, it's not updating, right? And the reason that happens is because we haven't created code to actually handle that update, right? So let's go ahead, let's do that. So here we are going to go ahead and set up a function that says we can just call it handle update. And then we are going to go ahead and set that equal to, we're going to use arrow function notation. If you guys aren't too comfortable with arrow function notation, you guys can also just set up a function just using the keyword function, handle update, parentheses, and curly braces. And this will go ahead and do the same thing as well. It's just arrow functions are kind of like the new way to write functions in JavaScript, especially with their most recent additions. So it's definitely like one thing to look into to kind of stay with like the modern version of JavaScript. So once we're here, what we are going to do is we are going to go ahead, call upon our variable that deals with updating our count variable. So we're going to go ahead and call set count. We're going to pass in the value of count, and we're going to add 1 to it. Once we're done, we can go ahead and save that and try out our code now. Notice that even now, nothing happens. Do you guys have any ideas as to why nothing happens now? Right, we've created the handle update. We should be able to see our output. How come we don't see our output? Yeah, right. So we need to call the function inside the div, right? Not exactly inside the div. It's going to be inside the button. And the reason I say it's inside the button is because whenever we click on the button, that's when we want to update our count variable, right? We don't want to update it when we click on the general div, right? So we want to make sure that we are selecting the correct element. So here I'm going to write on click. And kind of like how we did with props, we're going to set it up that way, except this time I'm going to go ahead and use curly braces because, again, we're using JavaScript code. And here we're going to write the name of the function that handles our update. Now, one thing you guys might have noticed here was notice the on click, right? if you guys have programmed in HTML and CSS and JavaScript before, you guys might notice that the on-click looks a little bit different in just vanilla JavaScript, as they like to call it. So vanilla JavaScript is just plain JavaScript, right? But notice here in React, we see this weird syntax, right? We see camel case, right? And the reason it does this is like how React works and how it's able to convert everything, right? So here, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and just leave it as on click. But sometimes in vanilla JavaScript, you guys might notice it's on click with everything being lowercase, right? So this is something that you guys will have to watch out for when developing in React. Is a lot of the components or a lot of the properties or like the inbuilt properties are going to be using camel case structure, right? So let's go ahead and let's save this. Perfect. And if we click on the button, notice that now it's updating our value, right? And the moment we refresh, right, notice what happens now, right? It went ahead and reset the value, right? So what does this mean? If the value works whenever we don't refresh, right? So this means that our value is being stored inside of that section. And whenever we reload, we're reloading everything, right? So we're kind of starting from scratch, right? So you can kind of think of it as resetting our use state back to 0, right? Whenever I click on reload, right? So this is definitely one thing to watch out for is, if your application requires you to refresh a lot, you might be better off storing that data elsewhere, perhaps like in a database. This way, your data stays the same despite the amount of refreshes or, despite whatever happens with the browser, right? If the browser crashes, if you want to maintain that data, you might want to put that into a database, right? Okay, so does anyone have any questions so far? I know we're running a little bit over time, but this is the last thing that we had for today. Nope. Okay. If we don't have any questions, we'll go ahead. We'll close up for today then. Okay. So for deploying, I recommend that you guys use GitHub Pages to host your websites. And this way it kind of makes it easier to update your website because you guys can push any new code there. For example, if you guys, need to update your resume, need to update your bio, add a new project, you guys can, just commit your code, push your code, and do all that stuff on GitHub. If you guys are wondering how exactly to do that, I've provided a link inside of the React cheat sheet. I'll go ahead and I'll send it again. If you guys just go over to the resources tab, the last link there will show you guys how you guys can deploy your React app on GitHub Pages. And it also has tons of more resources. So, if you guys forget what the commands are for React, all the commands are there. So you guys can always reference that, as well as just like general GitHub commands, how to push your code to GitHub, as well as basic terminal commands, right? So, for example, if you want to create a project in a certain part of your computer, maybe like under desktop or under documents, it helps you kind of like navigate your way through and discusses those topics as well. So with that being said, that's it for today's workshop on like introduction to React and front-end development. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask them now, or you guys can always ask me on Discord. I'm part of the ACM Discord, so you guys can always just reach out to me if you guys, have more questions about React, or if you guys run into any problems, how to like solve those problems. Feel free to ask me. All right, thank you. Thank you for attending today's workshop. We'll hopefully see you guys in the next one. Yeah. Thank you for attending. Definitely, if you guys are looking for projects to do in React, the first one I recommend is a personal portfolio. It's one of the best ways to showcase your different projects, your different resumes, and also like a little bit of your own character, because here in your personal portfolio, you kind of show something outside of your resume, right? Your resume is very structured, right? To be like, oh, you have to include this data in this format. This way, it passes the automated resume section and everything. But with a website, you kind of have all the freedom you want, right? The sky's your limit, right? Whatever you want, you can put onto your own website and kind of showcase who you are without any limitations. How do you center a div? All right, when in doubt, this is a general web development technique. When in doubt, flexbox your way through everything. If you guys don't know what flexbox is, it's essentially just a way to arrange elements inside of that div, right? So definitely look into flexbox. Flexbox or bootstrap grid. All right, if that's it, I will see you guys next time.